I want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners for the land I'm sitting on today. I'm in Wurundjeri country in Melbourne, in Brunswick in Melbourne, and I acknowledge the elders past, present and future, and the reality that these lands are unceded, and we welcome any people of any Indigenous Australians here today. Welcoming and be good to have your involvement in this day. This session is it's called Reimagining Society, which is why you're here. So let me just, a couple of things first, a bit of housekeeping. For those of you who don't know anything about NINA, NINA is the New Economy Network of Australia, and it's a network of Australia. I'm going to read this because Michelle Maloney, who many of you will know, normally does this bit. She's off on family business today, so she's asked if I could step in her shoes. So you've got a far less capable person stepping in, but so I'm going to read the little blurb so I don't get it wrong. A network of individuals and organizations working to transform the economic system in Australia. And it's looking to achieve ecological health and social justice, and they're the primary or the foundational principles that drive our economic system. So many of you will be working around those issues or interested in those issues, and that's what I think this topic will be about today. The second thing is we're going to have Bernard and Sonia are going to give their presentations. Then there's be a chance for questions. So because this is not so much of an open conversation, it's going to be more of a Q&A. If you have a question, please put it in the chat and I'll remind you at various times. If you want a question, so you're welcome to chat away, but if you want a question to be considered by Bernard or Sonia, please write at the start, question, then your question. Then I'll be able to pick that up. It'll make life much easier for me. Okay. What else do I need to do? If also, feel free, and in fact, we'd invite you to introduce yourself in the chat, and particularly what First Nations country you're coming from. So an acknowledgement of traditional owners from where you're coming from is very welcome and quite important to us all. Okay. Look, without further ado, I want to introduce, first of all, Bernard Thomson. We had a little chat with Bernard before about how to introduce him. And so the things that stuck out for me that may not stick out for him, but were he started off in philosophy and economics at London School of Economics, but realized that an academic career was not for him. But he's taken those interests clearly in the sort of things that he's been doing. And he now holds a number of positions on various not-for-profits, including Economic Reform Australia, Rethinking Economics Australia, Citizens Assembly in South Australia, and most interestingly, the Australian Hemp Council. So I suspect he's got a lot from his CV, he's got a lot to offer. So Bernard, I'm going to hand over to you, and when we look forward to maybe around a 15-minute presentation from you. So over to you.
Thanks very much, Simon. Well, I'll jump straight in and maybe just make my purpose clear, and it will come up. I just need to clear 1 second. Right, you can all see that screen, Reimagining Society. My thesis, or in thinking about this topic, I thought, well, we often complain about what we've got. You know, we don't like this, neoliberalism, this, that, and the other. I think, well, why have we got what we've got? And I'm suggesting we've got what we've got because it is the mirror showing us who we are. What we have put into it is what we're looking at. If we don't like it, we need to start putting something else into the mirror. So that's my kind of starting point. And I'll take you through my slides, which are... Let me just see. There we go. So we need to reimagine. And that means doing something we're not doing with our normal everyday thinking. We've got to reach somewhere else. So society we live in reflects our collective imagination. You'll be familiar with that quote from Einstein that we can't solve problems from the same level of consciousness that created them. And we tend to sort of nod at that and say, yeah, that's of course. But what does it really mean? And how would we know whether we're sort of reaching beyond our, what I'd like to call pedestrian consciousness? What does it take? And then there's a nice little one from Yogi Berra, also quite well known: the future ain't what it used to be. So what we used to think about it, we have to try and, think new thoughts. So that's just to kick us off. And I want to give you these are just glimpses into different perspectives of how we might start to reimagine things or think things anew. So there's the individual, an evolutionary view, and contemporary conditions. Now, these are just sketches. They're hopefully sort of launch pads for further reflection. So we exist in 3 distinct dimensions. That's each of us. We have 3 modes of existence, if you like, which I will sort of indicate here. So each of us is an individual. We claim that identity, to think what we think, have our own feelings, our whole interior world, our uniqueness. Everyone stands on their own in a certain sense in this respect. And we refer to that, of course, as I am, and I think, feel, and so on. And I have everything that belongs to me, both interior qualities as well as physical attributes. That's me as an individual. Okay, that's one dimension that we work out of in this life, in this society. So the next one is me as a producer or consumer. So I interact with my environment. I obviously consume to sustain myself, and depending on my place in life, I contribute to meeting the needs of others. It is an unavoidable part of our existence that we need to consume. And of course, we can only consume when others produce, and we will be one of those others for most of our, or much of our lives as well. So everything we're doing that meets others' needs, and everything that's been done that's meeting our needs, identifies us as a different, in a different way of existing. So I'm just indicating that me, the producer, consumer. That's really where economics sits in that domain. And then there is a third dimension, which is equally important, and that's me as a member of a group. We all belong to society in various ways, as citizens, as colleagues, as friends, and whatever. And because we exist in that way, we are subject to the laws of the land, the rules of the group, all kinds of arrangements. The arrangements that we made for this webinar this morning were all things we entered into to set the time, agree the duration of the webinar, etc. So we live in a whole web of regulation and agreements and so on that we are subject to for our mutual well-being. And that's quite regardless of who I am as an individual. I still drive on the left like everybody else. And my needs to produce and consume, again, are quite separate from the fact that I have entitlements and obligations. So let those sit with you. 3 modes of being. And of course, in any one moment, we are existing in all 3. Think of them as lenses that sort of overlap, but we may be primarily active in one or the other, but we're always existing all 3. They are like functional systems that overlap. So to sort of sum it up, there's a working life, a working world, which relates to the economy. There's our existence within laws and regulations, etc., which we in our Western societies generally consume under democratic principles. And then as individuals, we're creative. There we find art, science, recreation, culture, everything that has to do with the expression and development of human capacities. Moving along. Now, an evolutionary view. So that's one lens, just to think of us in 3 modes of existence. I'm now just going to stretch our perspective into evolution. a historical sort of sketch. I'm proposing that there was once a unitary world where, and indigenous cultures will be much more familiar with that, or ancient cultures, where everything belonged together and it was all guided and supported by various beings that belong both in heaven and earth. And these were then over time sort of incorporated into social structures. So a unitary world was the beginning. And I should say, for those who are anxious, I'll forget this, that there will be a PDF option where you can look at this again if you like. So the gods rule. Nature comes up from the other side, but it's all intertwined in this unitary world. And our social life exists between the gods and nature and is guided by them. So then there's a kind of division starts to take place, and I've sort of indicated that with God above and heaven and Caesar on earth. And we know that biblical quote, give unto Caesar what is his and unto God what is his, or something like that, that there is an awareness comes about that we've now actually got two domains that are sort of distinct, and the interaction becomes more a question for debate. Well, what belongs where and how does that all work? So there's a kind of dividing coming up between what was the divine aspect of our existence and what is now the temporal. And then as we move further into our times, we could say into our Renaissance and beyond, the God and heaven part sort of gets pushed into an area where we leave it for belief and the institutions of church and so on. And we are more and more increasingly concerned with our life in this terrestrial zone, and parliamentary democracy becomes a whole movement in Western history, and economics takes hold from what we call associated with the rise of the Industrial Revolution, when suddenly it becomes almost the focus of our existence. And today we've completely handed over our purpose to economics, trade, finance, etc. And I indicate, the Enclosures Act was a very important milestone in that, when we started to treat what was originally shared nature becomes now property to exploit, etc. I'll leave the notes a bit below for you to read. You can read them later. So that's the historical view. We've moved from what was unitary to a dualism, and now to three elements you saw: democracy, the divine part, and economics. And you can link those to the previous three modes of existence that we currently exist in. Now, contemporary conditions, another sort of picture onto the story. You'll be familiar with these French words because they were a clarion call for, well, the whole of Western civilization, one could say, that spread from, not just from France, but across Europe and of course into America. Liberty, égalité, fraternité. So freedom, equality, brotherhood, sisterhood, the connection between us all. So there's the three. And we've often, perhaps I should say, if you've thought of those terms, you think, oh yes, they sound very noble aims, noble goals, but what does it really mean? We kind of like them. They seem to speak to us, but how does it work? And there's been a lot of discussion about, well, can you have liberty and equality? Are they not in conflict? And isn't this fraternity thing really just a sort of wishful thinking, because we're actually not like that? All the same, they speak to us in a certain sense. So I'm now giving them a place in our three zones: the culture and the art, science, recreation that I was referred to earlier, the law, democracy, politics, there where we're all equal. So you can start to see, okay, culture, art, science, that's where we're all individual, where we want our free choice, our right to assert, our right to think, and so on. And then the last, the economy, production, consumption. And I've made this nicely drop into the respective boxes. It all looks rather tidy, but it's really for thinking further. So we might say today, it's so important that we have a freedom of expression, freedom to develop our own thoughts, and we resist government, or anyone else for that matter, corporates telling us what is of value in the arts, deciding what has purpose and so on. We all know that equality before the law is so essential, even if it's not always achieved, but it's clearly a principle we cannot resist. And the fraternity thing is a little bit more, perhaps not so evident in our economy, where we more or less say it's dog eat dog today, not let's look after each other. But if you reflect on any item that's right in front of you, a glass, a pen, a piece of paper, whatever it is, and then start to dig into, well, how did this come about that I have got this now in front of me? And you start to imagine or investigate all the processes that were involved in producing this item. And if it was a glass, it came from sand. Where was the sand? How was it turned into glass? Where was the energy? All those, you'll start to realize pretty soon that you have a massive chain of events, which effectively is a collaborative chain of events, quite aside from whatever people might have had in their heads about why they're working. The reality is they're all working together to produce all the items we're surrounded by. And then aside from the physical processes involved, there's of course all the ingenuity, the intelligence, and you can reach right back into the history of ideas and science to see what's gathered together in everything that surrounds us. And that is truly an amazing feat of human collaboration, in spite of our egotistical attitude towards it. So that's my justification for placing that fraternity in the economic realm, which is essentially one of collaboration. And that's the end of that. So I hope that was of interest for you, but let's leave that to the follow-up. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernard. That was I've written a lot of notes, so I've got a bunch of questions for you for later if no one else does. So thank you so much, because that's a very comprehensive and very broad sort of outline of our sort of social positioning. So let's just, we're going to hold questions, just a reminder, we're going to hold questions just at this point. If you have a question, please put it in the chat and start by saying question or my question. So it helps me identify the questions and I'll address them in the order that they arrive. So anything, if you want to get in quick, now's the chance to drop your question in there and we'll pick it up after Sonia has spoken. So now I'll introduce Sonia Randhawa. She is a founding, I'm reading her blurb by the way, and you've probably all read this anyway, a founding member of the Coalition of Everyone and project manager for the Sortition Foundation, which is a fascinating organization. I had a bit of a scurry through the website yesterday, so a really fascinating organization doing some really interesting work. She studied philosophy and politics and economics, so there's a theme in the presenters today, and she studied the history of women journalists in Malaysia as a postgraduate. She has also worked as a journalist in Australia, Malaysia, and the UK, and is actively involved in campaigns for media freedom and community media in Malaysia. She is one of NINA's Democracy and Governance Hub conveners. Without saying any more, Sonia, it's over to you.
Thanks very much for that, Simon. And thanks, Bernard, for that great talk. My talk's going to be quite different. It's a lot less philosophical in some ways and more grounded in what we can in things which are happening. But I think that one of the key overlaps is that both of us are thinking about how we can rethink key structures and ideas in society. And as Simon said before we started the thing, the stories we tell ourselves about what it means to be a member of a society and a person that's part of a community as well. So I've called this Tools and Ideas for Revitalizing Citizenship, but I really think it's more about what I said just now, the ways in which we tell stories about who we are and who the society that we live in is as an entity. So I'd like to start with where we are. Hold on, there we go. We currently have Australia's most diverse cabinet, and in some ways it's done really well in terms of comparatively with previous iterations of cabinets in Australia. It has 43% women, which is about equal to the number of women in this parliament. It's about 21% of the population is not of British origin, and I reckon that it's about a sixth of the cabinet is not of British origin either. So, you know, we're trending upwards on that. But as you can see at pretty much a glance even at this cabinet, there are key people that aren't represented there. One of the first key groups of people that aren't in that room, or those rooms, aren't in the cabinet, are young people. There are very few young people there. I think that this lady here is probably the youngest, and I think we've got probably nobody under the age of 25 there. And yet the young people are key to inheritors of of the decisions that are being made at the moment, particularly at this pivotal point in history where so much rests upon what we do in the next 5 years, as I'm sure everybody in this room is aware. The other thing about this group of people, in the commentary around it, it was Australia's most skilled cabinet, which tends to make me think that we are lacking diversity in the background of the people there. It's great to have skilled people on one level, but when you don't have people who have spent time living on welfare, you don't have people who don't have educational qualifications, you don't have people who have spent vast amounts of time unemployed, you're missing key aspects of the lived experience of Australians. And we know that diversity in a room helps to improve decision making. So I think that the story that we can see in this, our most diverse cabinet, is a story that says that certain people's experiences and certain people's ideas are somehow more valid and more important than others. And also it tells us a bit about what our aspirations are as well as a country. We want to have diversity upon particular axes, but not necessarily on all when we look at the people that we see as being successful. However, and that's a reflection to a large extent of this of the political story that we're in at the moment, which is that politics is about competition. Politics is about the people whose it's about the best ideas, a marketplace of ideas, and the best ideas winning in a competition which is really just about us and them. So it's competitive rather than collaborative, and it's very much focused on a rational idea of the world as well. Now, politics hasn't always been this way, and while there are much older stories that we can tell about our place in the world, the story I'm going to trace, which I recognize as an incomplete one, and it's still a very Eurocentric and very male-dominated one, is going back to ancient Athens, which is considered to be the birthplace of Western democracy. And their elections were only used for positions where you were required to have particular experience, things like generals and the like. It was not used for political decision making. it was thought to be democratic for officers of constitutional government to be assigned by lot. And if they were elected, it was oligarchic, as that quote says. I haven't actually been able to track down where this quote came from. It's one that my the founder of the Sortition Foundation uses quite a lot. So I've stuck with it. If anybody ever does find exactly where he got this quote, that would be really interesting to know. But basically what it's saying is that elections are by their nature privileging certain types of people. They privilege people who have the time and inclination to run for office. Now, I know that you tend to find women, for example, are a lot less willing to run for office, partly because of the ways in which women tend to be sexualized. I mean, we saw this with Julia Gillard as Prime Minister. When we have lots of very sexualized assaults on her character that men aren't subjected to. And that's a feature of women in public life across the media, across politics, across various different fields. You also need to have the resources in terms of time, in terms of money, in order to be able to stand. And so you're privileging certain types of people by through an electoral system. It's also that with elections, you need to have resources in order to support your campaign. So, which is why we see the power of money is very important in elections, fundraising, and the power of the media to support particular candidates all have a disproportionate influence on helping to us, in theory, to decide who sits in government. Now, obviously, there were problems with the ancient Athenian way of doing things, in particular the exclusion of slaves and women. But in terms of the defining democracy, it was, we think that that's an interesting idea that we could play around with quite a lot more. Sorry, it's taking a while for my slide. So, as I say, democracy was by lottery and aristocracy was through elections, whereas we now tend to think of elections as being democratic. However, in the past couple of decades, we're finding that democratic lotteries are being used increasingly across the world for decision-making purposes, and some of these are already permanent. In Australia, we have one permanent citizens panel, which is in Mornington on the south coast of Victoria, where they have a standing panel of citizens to advise council, which is replaced on an annual basis. The way in which people are selected for these panels, juries, assemblies, they're called various different things, is they're first of all chosen through a democratic lottery. So they're basically, people are invited through a process of randomly selecting addresses to take part in these processes. They register, giving demographic details, and then they are chosen according to match the population. So you'd have equal numbers by design of men and women. You'd have equal numbers of people according to educational qualification by design. By design, you would have equal numbers of people in different age groups. So you would have far more young people involved in the decision-making processes. And so everybody, I apologize if you can hear my dog in the background. My kids are away, so my dog has decided to take up the slack in terms of making lots of noise. You've got more equality and more diversity built into the system as stands. So the process of these things is also very different from a parliament. So in parliament, the architecture itself is adversarial. You have people sitting opposite each other, and they are representing different points of view, and they are fighting with each other. And that's how it's designed. I mean, as I say, even in the architecture. With something like a citizens' assembly as a decision-making process, you are sitting around tables, or sometimes they do away with the tables entirely because they find that aids decision making, where you can walk around more and look at things, and it aids interaction between different people. People are given information they meet and they discuss their different perspectives. And usually the question is, why do you hold the perspective that you hold? So people get a better understanding of the reasons why people might hold polar opposite opinions to them. And that helps them to come together to think about what they can live with and what they think would be the best way forward. So it's not public opinion, which just captures perspective at a particular point of time and isn't necessarily informed. It is instead public judgment. In terms of who we are, we're a small not-for-profit company that advocates for real democracy, and we for Sortition Foundation. The Coalition of Everyone is also a not-profit, and we're based here in Melbourne. We're working with Participatory Melbourne and the Regen Australia movement to advocate for deeper decision-making processes. I'm going to just go through this bit very quickly. I wanted to talk a little bit about the Global Citizens Assembly, because one of the reasons why we advocate for deliberative democracy is because it's possible to bring together, to get a sample which is representative of very large populations. And the most ambitious thing that we've done to date was we worked on a Global Citizens Assembly for which was held prior to COP26, which brought together 100 people that were randomly selected from all across the world to be demographically representative of the world, which was an absolutely amazing experience. There's lots of videos that you can see of the people that were involved. There's a seamstress from Brazil, for example, is the one that really stuck in my mind. But there were people who had never participated in any sort of political processes before that took part. I mean, obviously it was a massive undertaking in terms of just translation and things like that. You'll also notice that there was nobody from Australia there, because we are, in terms of population, a very, very small percentage of the world, and for 100 people we didn't get selected to have somebody in the room, whereas China had quite a lot of people in the room, just again because of the population differences. India likewise. So it was a fascinating experience, and it really showed how you can move from having a large population to having a manageable group of people who are very diverse, representing very diverse interests and backgrounds, coming together and having real conversations about real issues. Our major campaign is actually currently in the UK about replacing the House of Lords with a House of Citizens. So this is, again, I think very much about reimagining the stories of what politics is, rather than an elite group of people, a group of people that look like the rest of the country. What we would like to see here in Australia is, we think that it would be really interesting, particularly in Queensland, to look at having a second house there chosen by democratic lottery. I think that would be a great starting point. We're still also interested in having processes run at every level of government. So that's all for my slides, but I actually want to end with where I started in some way, by just inviting you to think about not just the levels of government that we have at the moment, and not just the ways in which we define citizenship at the moment, but thinking about what it might mean. And here I think there is very much an interaction with the economic side of things. Imagine if we had a society where we had one day a month that we of sort of paid leave for everyone, or part of our universal basic income, or some way of it being funded, where we were sponsored to take part in democratic decision-making processes at the local, regional, or government level. And everybody got a chance to come together with people in their community or higher levels, and higher by geography rather than sort of like a hierarchical higher, to come together and discuss issues of importance for our community, for our future, and for how we want to define ourselves as citizens. Because I think that's where it gets really exciting, when we think about how we could build in sort of daily democratic processes, or continuing ongoing democratic processes into our daily lives. So I'd like to leave that as an invitation.
Sonia, thank you. My goodness, there's a heap of things to think about in that presentation, and I think they're all super important. So can I please remind people, if you want a question, there's one arrived already, put it in the chat and start with question. So let me, I've got some questions, but I'll just see how I'll delay mine to later. So there's a question to either of you. How important is belief? This is from Kevin Cox. How important is belief, and how do you randomize it? How important is belief, and how do you randomize dealing with it? Who wants to have a crack at that one?
Could I maybe ask Kevin to explain what type of belief he's talking about? Whether you're talking about sort of like spiritual belief, or yeah, what sort of belief are you talking about?
Yes, well, that of course is the problem. I've been on a few of these sortition groups, and I've managed to get selected through the process of making the random selection not quite so random. And it turns out to be relatively straightforward if you do that, in order to be able to figure out how to get part of these groups, because in practice very few people actually volunteer to become part of them, and so you and a group of you can tend to dominate these things if you wish. But that's just another aside. But what you find is that and also that's associated with the people who put themselves up for being part of the sortition process. You find that people with particular sorts of belief will tend to get onto these things. So how are you going to handle that situation? How do we get real sortition?
Yeah, great question,
rather
Kevin.
Than just.
Yep, I think that's pretty clear. Sonia.
Yep. Thanks, Kevin. So I think that I think it depends on how the sortition process is run. So the way that we do it at the Sortition Foundation is we do a two-step process. So the first step is you send out invitations to people who are randomly selected by a postal address. And that means that everybody in theory, except for people that don't have a postal address, which I'm not denying that those people exist. We have been working on how to include people who experience homelessness and things like that as well. But that's a huge discussion that I could go on about. But so first of all, and then we check the addresses to make sure that everybody who registers did actually receive an invite. So you can't, that makes it harder for people to try and play the system. So that's one thing. The second thing is that the ways in which people are chosen randomly, it's according to demographics to be representative of the population. Now, as you say, there are certain groups of people that are more likely to register than others. We tend to find that people in the age groups of 50 to 70 are far more likely to register than people in any other age groups. Particularly hard is the 16 to 24 age group to get. We're trying to address that by doing outreach work with universities and schools and the like. We also find that people tend to be better educated than average, and that's a really hard one to address. But by actually asking people the question about their highest level of qualification, we can get as many people as possible with lower levels of education into the room as we can. We very rarely manage to make it identical, which does mean that there are ways of playing the system in terms of, if you say that you have no education and you've actually got a PhD, then you are far more likely to be selected if you lie about that. So we do rely on people's honesty in deciding it. Obviously, if there was a sort of if it was akin to jury duty, where if you are selected, you have a duty to attend, then that would overcome all of those problems of being able to stack the system and of the disproportional levels of people being involved. So, and that's actually a big debate within the whole democratic lottery movement. I hope that answers some of the questions you've had.
Can I just have a quick follow-up one? The other problem that I've observed is that the experts that come in are certainly not random, and these things are run by organisations who want a particular answer very often, and who they get to brief the people is probably more important than the people that you actually select. How do you handle that problem?
Sure. So the best sort of citizens' assembly processes, the participants make the decision about who it is that's going to inform them. Now, for example, this is a controversial one, so bear with me while I tell the whole story rather than just the South Australian Citizens' Jury on Nuclear Waste. The participants were asked to choose the experts that would have informed the citizens' jury, but they were given categories of people that they could choose. So, for example, there were people, economists, geologists, and environmentalists, for example. I'm not sure exactly what the categories were. It didn't work because the South Australian government was not happy with the people that were chosen by the jury. And actually, while they did go with the experts that were chosen by the jury, they also parachuted in some of their own experts, which completely undermined the process. So that was a problem. But for example, for the French climate convention, for a lot of the processes that happen at local government level, the jurors, the panelists get to decide who the experts are themselves. So yeah, I think.
Okay, thanks, Sonia. That's wonderful. Next question from Natasha Lewis. Aside from money and other aspects of politics, other aspects of politics are restrictive, especially the rise of hate speech and terrorism/violence against women, trans people, and gender minorities and people of color. What kinds of extra supports could we have to support people who are currently facing these barriers to entering the deliberative space?
Thanks very much, Natasha. So the question, there's a couple of different aspects to that question. The first one is, given that it's a voluntary process to register, how do we persuade people to register? And at the moment we have maybe one, maybe two instruments. They're kind of the same instrument twice, money. So we do try to remunerate people, and we strongly suggest that people that are invited to these processes and participate in these processes should be paid for their time. And that makes it more feasible for a wide range of people and a wide range of backgrounds to take part. I was just learnt about a process in Germany that's been happening recently, where they actually found that they had a higher percentage of young people registering than they did of any other age groups, and they felt that that was because of the remuneration, that young people were more motivated and that remuneration was high enough for that to be a case. The other thing is that we also advocate for supporting people in terms of things like childcare, in terms of accessibility, making processes as accessible as possible from that wide range of things. In terms of things like that's the first stage, is first of all getting people to register, and the second thing is, how do you support people while they're actually in the room? And this is quite personal. We recently were part of a process with Aaron Violi, who's the Liberal MP for Casey, and he wanted to know what his constituents thought through a deliberative process on The Voice. And I was quite uncomfortable in the room because I felt that the atmosphere was quite racist. There was one person that was an Indigenous woman, and she left the room. And so it was really on the facilitators to offer the support. She was asked if she wanted to be with a different group of people who weren't quite as stridently racist as the group. She found herself in amongst the worst people that were in the room, in my opinion. And so she was offered support about, in terms of the way in which they voiced out their opinions on this. She felt supported enough to continue staying in that group and in those conversations. So I was I was kind of in awe of her, but that support is really necessary, particularly in spaces where there is, it's a difficult issue and there aren't going to be the representative, in terms of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander representation in the room was demographically representative. The experts were all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but that doesn't mean that we had tried to get 2 Indigenous people sitting on every table, but we weren't able to do that for a variety of obvious reasons, I would suspect. So there are ways in which we can try to do these things. It doesn't always work as well as we'd like, but it's up to the facilitation. Does that answer? I see you've put your hand out, so I'm hoping that answers the question.
Thanks again, Sonia. Yeah, they're really, really important questions. And the whole sort of history of deliberative democracy, and how you create these sort of citizen spaces that everyone has equal opportunity, where you reduce power and you have, in a sense, a equal playing field, is really important, but also challenging to do. We'll never get it right, never be perfect, but that's the intention, I think, of these processes. I've got the next question is, and we don't want to spend too long on this one because you could go for years on this one. The question is from Jill Boehringer. How would this make a big difference? Let's suppose the capitalist system of exploitation and repression was overthrown tomorrow. Bang, it's gone. I mean, I can't imagine it personally, but let's imagine it. Would we then need these systems? Are they, in a sense, a band-aid for a type of political capture of the current capitalist system? And maybe Bernard, you might have some views on this as well. So I want to bring you in as if I can as well. So either you or Sonia.
Well, it's a question. I was just thinking about that kind of issue. Is sortition a sort of remedy to a corrupted process, or is it a model, a target, so to speak, a goal that this is where we should go? And I think to some extent it belongs to our time, the disillusionment with the combative process, the so-called Westminster process in particular. Not every country has quite the same starting conditions. But I think the bigger issue of participation and whether we use the word empowerment or engagement, I think that goes much deeper. And disillusionment with the system, that can sort of spread into everything that people can't connect to. So I think there's a deeper issue there about disconnection. And I would put that back to our sort of cultural malaise, which of course is to some extent influenced by our whole technological environment. So a lot of the things that we're trying to address are symptoms. And I think we always have to think further, well, what's it a symptom of and how has it come about? And what's the challenge? Is it just to reduce the damage or actually advance ourselves as human beings through confronting or engaging with the conditions we're in? And I think that's also to be considered.
Yep.
If I can say, I'll try to keep this very brief because I know we've only got 7 more minutes and there's still quite a lot of questions. I think that it's, I read your question as, what difference will it make if we don't overthrow capitalism, rather than if we've overthrown capitalism, then will we still need these things? And I think that one of the advantages of it is that if you've got people in the room that aren't as beholden to vested interests as you do currently, then we've seen time and time again that they do make decisions which big business doesn't like. So, for example, the recommendations made by the French Climate Convention, the recommendations made on local levels, they tend to take into account future generations and long-term interests far more than our current political systems do. And I'm not saying that they're ideal, and I do agree that they might well be a stepping stone to other things. I think they are a stepping stone to overthrowing the system of exploitation and repression. As much as anything else, I think that they help to redress the power imbalance between the people with lots of money and the people without.
Thank you for that. I'm going to use my prerogative here, and I see Natasha's got her hand up for some time, but also got the question that she's posed in the about how can we use other examples of deliberative democracy in action. So she loves the classics, Greek history, but there are many other examples that we do not use, which could be alienating for people. Actually, Natasha, do you want to have a quick, do you want to speak to the local very, very briefly?
Yeah, it's not really a very particularly articulate question, but I guess I work in government and policy. So I'm an Indian first generation migrant woman, but it's quite easy for me to access these spaces because, you know, I have postgraduate education, I work in policy, you know, I can join these kinds of discussions. But if I wanted to connect to Indigenous peoples or migrant and refugee communities, I don't know if this would be the forum in which to connect with them, because I don't necessarily think that it's about money, but I also think it's about cultural accessibility, and it's about building spaces that actually feel really inclusive. And I worry that sometimes in academic and policy spaces, despite the best intentions, including I have them myself, I host Zoom webinars all the time, we don't get people we want to reach to join us. And maybe it's because we're, you know, having these discussions that are a little bit exclusive. Just putting it out there.
Great point. So Bernard, Sonia, any thoughts?
Yep, I agree. We need, I mean, there's, for example, you find that in face-to-face discussions, deliberations, that people who are particularly from ethnic minorities might take part in the formal deliberative processes, but there are very different experiences when it comes to having coffee. And that's where the different, and how to pay attention to those processes. I can only reiterate what I was saying before. It's an ongoing process of trying to learn learn different ways of doing things and trying to improve that. Currently, we're really trying to pay attention to how we engage with Indigenous Australians, because I think that's the biggest issue. And I'm Malaysian, I'm first generation migrant as well. And I'm very well aware of the problems that exist with censuses in terms of the history of colonization. And to be relying so heavily on those as a process, because in Malaysia they were used very much as part of the divide and rule and divide and conquer part of the British Empire. And just that process of defining people through race and things like that is one that I find very problematic on one level. Yet at the same time, what we're doing is trying to use them to compensate for a lack of power in other spaces. So there are a lot of tensions there, and we're just trying to improve things as we go along as well, as much as we can.
I'd like to add that I think one of the challenges of how do we reach across cultural divides from the PhD person to the unemployed or whatever, you know, where we see there's a big difference, or it could be, of course, ethnic and other, you know, language divides. There are, I think, our reservoir of hope lies in cultural activity, and by that I mean very broadly musical, artistic, and so on. Because somewhere in that, particularly music, maybe, there is a sort of universal language that speaks to everybody. You don't have to be clever to appreciate music. You don't have to be sophisticated. There are ways that one can share musical experience, participate collectively, that goes way beyond intellectual prowess or sophistication. And I feel we must give more and more attention to what I'd call the sort of cultural fundament of what it is to be a human being, and from there build relationship, rather than trying to think we can do it sort of intellectually or through reasoning.
Thanks, Bernard. Sonia, any final comments? Okay, we have reached our we've got 1 hour. Our hour's almost over. And this again represents one of the challenges of getting people together to actually talk through things. It takes a lot of time, but it's super important. And I found this, particularly the work that I've done in deliberative democracies many years ago, a great reminder of how important it is for engagement in this time of alienation. So this has been a really valuable and important discussion. We're not going to solve everything. We're not going to get the perfect system, but all of these things are steps towards rebuilding social connection that Bernard and Sonia have been talking about. So I want to thank everyone. I want to also say sorry to Tony, my friend, Gleeson. He had a couple of actually practical questions about what the Citizens Assembly was referring to in the peninsula, and what else is happening in Australia. So maybe Tony, if you want to contact Sonia at the Sortition Foundation directly, sure, that might be a way to do it.
We're in touch quite a bit.
Oh, you're okay. Yeah, well, everybody anyone knows Tony. Okay, thanks so much, everybody. Please, if you're not obviously you know about NENA, the New Economies Network Australia. If you're not a member, can I really encourage you to consider joining? It's really helpful. Very small amount of money, $35 or something for a year for an individual, but it really is helpful for us building this network that we can continue to sponsor and support these sorts of conversations. So again, thanks so much, everyone, and particularly my thanks to Bernard and Sonia. If you guys want to stay on the line for a moment, that'd be great. And Sarah, of course, and thanks to Sarah for keeping the ship upright as we move through all this, and to everyone who's come along. And I would hope we could have another session around this. We can actually have more in-depth conversations. So my apologies if this question and answering isn't really conducive to deliberation. So we can set up perhaps another way of doing this, perhaps a workshop where we can actually deliberate and work through these sort of questions in a more sort of discursive way. So again, thanks so much. I wish you a great day, and we'll see you at another seminar soon. Take care.